Johnny Miller to welcome back. Now, Johnny, thanks very much for joining us. I'll come to you on the Middle East issues in a minute, if I may. But whilst the Western public appears almost like a magic wand has been waved, to have entirely forgotten the poor people of the Ukraine that they cruelly abused. That cannot be true, of course, in Russia, where you work. It cannot be true because the war drags on. Tell us the atmosphere over the proxy war now that everyone has moved on.
Well, predictions tend to make fools of all men. I think you made some predictions before in your life, George, which proved to be very true. But I don't make many. But I predicted before the Ukrainian counteroffensive started back in March or April, the Ukrainian counteroffensive would be a complete failure. Anybody who has any understanding of this conflict knows perfectly well that the Ukrainian counteroffensive would be a failure. Not just for myself, who's a journalist working on the other side of the conflict. All this incredible propaganda campaign of the apparent inability of the Russian army, lack of morale. I spent a lot of time in Donetsk, obviously speaking to Russian soldiers. Most of the mobilized Russian soldiers are conscripted from Russian society. The vast majority of Russian society, it's not a flag-waving, gung-ho joy about this war. It's more of a quiet resignation to they have to win this war. They feel threatened and they'll do what they have to do to win it. And it's been a massive miscalculation from NATO to think that they could amount to a strategic defeat on Russia. And that's proven correct. I think you've had many people on your show before, George, who understood that very well. It's been very clear. And I think it's been a massive failure by mainstream Western debate. If you're in a think tank, if you're a journalist, if you said what I said, that the Ukrainian counteroffensive would be a failure back in March or April, you'd lose your job. And there's been a massive failure of Western mainstream debate to understand the political realities. And that's what we've seen in this war in Ukraine, a failure of NATO's understanding of the current political realities. So at the moment,
it's impossible to overstate the scale of that miscalculation, isn't it? We have not only burned our relations with Russia, the biggest country in the world, pushed it into apparently indissoluble closeness with China, the other West adversary, and we have effectively sunk our own economies, spending uncountable billions of taxpayers' money to fuel a war which we've now literally walked away from. I mean, this is not a mistake on the level of the income tax or a mistake in HS2, the high-speed rail link. This is a historical turning point in world affairs and the expenditure of a king's ransom on a war we have all now walked away from.
Yeah, I think in Western mainstream debates, we see people, it's reserved to, do you condemn this person? Do you condemn this person? Do you condemn Putin? Do you condemn Hamas? And there's a complete breakdown of intellectualism and political realism. The reality is that the world is changing, that Western hegemony, the American hegemony is dying. I don't see it with any joy. It's just an analysis. It's just the reality. And China is no longer rising, it's risen. And Russia has become resurgent. And Western policy really needs to adapt to this changing world's reality. That is the reality. And I think that's what Ukraine has showed. So, you talk about the Middle East now. I hope that there are people in the security establishment which realize that war in the Middle East for Western powers is not in their interests. The world has changed, and I think that's what we're seeing, hopefully, and understanding from NATO, that their forecasts about what would happen in Ukraine, their desires to bring down Vladimir Putin government, the desire to launch a strategic failure or defeat on Russia was always pie in the sky. You've had many analysts on your show, I think, who understood this. We understand this. But of course, the problem is anybody who questions it, it ends up being defamed by the media, losing their jobs, attacked. You've got Julian Assange, of course, in jail. If everything else fails, let's just put him in jail. And it happens right down the pyramids. I'm a journalist with a moderate following. I do my best. I recently had death threats. I get attacked. You Google me, the attacks on me is insane. And I'm sure you have many people on your show, George. You highlight alternative journalists. I'm sure they all have similar stories of being attacked in all sorts of ways. And for me, the major problem with Western mainstream debate right now is anybody who questions, anybody who says that, look, this Ukrainian counteroffensive is going to be a failure. Everybody understands it. You'll lose your job. You'll lose it. And so they're blinding themselves. Any think tanks, any journalists, anybody in British politics, they're blinding themselves by attacking anybody and trying to destroy anybody who questions, because it's not in British interests. It's not in European interests. This Ukrainian war was never in our interests. And that's proving to be correct. And anybody else like myself, and I'm sure many people who've had on their show who come out and said it, is they try to attack and defame. And that for me is the major problem. That these attacks on any kind of alternative voices and try to bring reason to the conversation, try to bring the truth. That's the major problem for myself.
Now, the fighting is still continuing. What can you tell us about the front line, Johnny?
Well, to be honest, right now, the front line is more... The fog of war is stronger now than it ever was. I reported in Donetsk for much of this war. Right now, it's very difficult. Right now, we can see the Russian-Ukrainian offensive, the counteroffensive has failed. I expected it to have more success than it did, at least some success, but it hasn't. But right now, we see Russian incremental advances, particularly around Adievka. Adievka is very important because it's a Ukrainian fortress town on the outskirts of Donetsk. So I think the Russians are very keen to take that, to stop attacks on Donetsk. But it's difficult. War is hell. War is hell. It's difficult watching all the images of the Middle East right now. But Ukrainian war has been forgotten about for soldiers, particularly on both sides. War is hell, and I think most people don't realize how difficult it is. So the Ukrainian counteroffensive has failed. We'll have to see whether Russian advances will be more successful. But ultimately, we can see Ukraine now mobilizing women, the quality of their gang-pressing recruits into their army. Many people thought that Russia would have to mobilize again. If Russia wants to move to Kiev, they probably will have to mobilize again. But Russia hasn't mobilized again. We can clearly see that those who said from the start of this conflict that NATO wanted to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian is being proved correct, and that ultimately this war of attrition will be won by the country with the strongest manpower and resources. And as I said, NATO has massively underestimated Russia's resolve. So we're seeing that slow grind. As a journalist following this war, war is hell, and I feel for the soldiers on both sides.
Now, you mentioned the Middle East, as did I. Is the NATO pivot to the Middle East a kind of displacement activity in your view? We failed in Ukraine, we failed in Afghanistan before that, and so let's have another go somewhere else. Or is there a bigger picture here?
Well, that's the big question, George. And I'm sure you have amazing contacts and analysts you talk to, and that's a big question. I feel that, and many people are debating this now. I don't feel that this war in the Middle East is in Western, British, American interests. I think they realize that. I think that they realize, ultimately, all these wars now, they're on a broader scale. The United States is losing its hegemony. So I don't see that any joy. It's just a reality. The multipolar world is arriving. It's upon us. And so you're seeing an attempt by the United States to try to retain its global dominance. And what's in the way of that? China is the number one issue, of course. They're the number one threat. Russia, Iran. But the problem now for Western policymakers is that you have this rise in China, Russia, Iran, and most of the rest of the world. You have Latin America, India. India is more allied with Russia. So that's really the greater problem that you're having and you're seeing. And I think this new World War III that we're talking about is hopefully, I say that, you're hopefully going to end up with these small proxy wars rather than a nuclear war. And I think that's largely what we're seeing. But my view, and I may well be wrong with this, and this is the debate between analysts, and the mainstream, we don't really take seriously. These mainstream papers and mainstream broadcasters, they're not written for serious people. They're written for the group of the population, probably a majority, sadly, who just believe in them. But for thinking people like who watch your show, George, we talk about this. And frankly, I don't know your view on that, but my view is that I don't think the Americans and British Europeans want a wider war in the Middle East. I may well be wrong about that. I think they're trying to rein Israel back. I think they realize that a war with Iran, with the American military bases, etc., I don't think it's in their interest. And I think that some people in the security establishment realize that. And I think the mainstream journalists and politicians need to get on board and realize that it's not in American and British interest to have a wider war in the Middle East. I may well be wrong. There are other people, I don't know what you think, George, I doubt your knowledge. Maybe they want to really go for it and attack Iran. But my view is that I think they realize that this war, a wider war, is not in Western interests.